Architecture at Istanbul Technical University in 1975. He completed his master's degree in regional development at Pantheon University and his PhD at National Technical University of Athens. He was head of the technical division at the National Hellenic Research Foundation, where he retired in 2018, and he has published many articles on Istanbul's architecture and urban history. And his presentation today is entitled Memoirs of Arria Clondia, from Istanbul during the war period 1914 to 1922. We then will hear from Allison Panelas, who graduated from
Recording in progress.
Of the History Department of the University of California, Berkeley in 2017. She completed her first master's degree in global and imperial history at Oxford University, Corpus Christi College in 2019, and she is currently completing her second master's degree at the Department of History, Boğaziçi University. She undertakes research on the relationship between the Near East Relief Organization and the Ankara government during the Turkish War of Independence. And her title is a little different than in the program. It's Passports, Nationality, and Statelessness in late occupied Istanbul. And our third panelist is Ali Okumuş. His bachelor's and master's degrees, respectively in 2014 and 17, are from the History Department of Marmara University. He completed his PhD studies at the Bilecik Şeyh Edebali University's History Department in 2020, and he is currently an assistant professor at the same department. His research interests include the 19th century, the history of oil magnates, Ottoman mine concessions, Armenian merchants, and Istanbul's commercial life. I'd like to remind the panelists that they each have 20 minutes. I will try to be strict with this, but of course we're looking forward to their presentations and the opportunity for questions and engagement afterwards. So, Professor Tsilenis.
Thank you very much, sir. Günaydın bayanlar, baylar. Tebliğe başlamadan evvel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schull. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to first of all extend my thanks to the Hrant Dink Foundation and the Scientific Committee for the organization of this conference. During the First World War, the Ottoman Empire had to suffer heavy losses, and this is followed by Young Turks establishing the Committee of Progress and Union. Between 1914 and 1918, cosmopolitan Istanbul suffered a significant trauma due to the war.
Sadece screen. Evet.
Tabii ki. Yes.
Change. Tamam.
I paused your time.
Okay. Thank you. 1914-1918 yıllarında kozmopolit İstanbul Büyük Savaş'ın travmalarını acı bir şekilde yaşadı. İttihat ve Terakki liderleri Alman ordusunun ve 19. yüzyılın sonundan beri zemin kazanan milliyetçi ideolojinin rehberliğinde Trakya ve Anadolu'daki Hristiyan nüfusa yönelik uygulanan zulümlerden ve devamında yaşanan soykırımlardan sorumludur. Öte yandan başlangıçta Balkanlarda ve Doğu Avrupa'da görülen tarihsel gerçekler, yeni sınırların her iki tarafında da dev mülteci ve göç dalgalarına sebebiyet verdi ki, bu 1919'da Yunanistan ve Bulgaristan arasında yaşanan ilk nüfus değişimine yol açtı. Büyük Savaş'ın başlamasından biraz önce Eleftherios Venizelos, Yunanistan ve Türkiye arasında belli nüfusların gönüllü değişim planlarını değerlendirmek üzere Vezir Said Halim Paşa ile Brüksel'de bir araya gelmeyi planlıyordu. Ancak savaşın başlamasıyla bu buluşma iptal edildi. Ermeni sürgünü Rum nüfusunun kıyılarda uğradıkları zorbalıklar ve Rus İç Savaşı'nın neticesinde pek çok kadın ve yetimin
Deportation of Armenians, Russian Civil War, and also Belarusians, thousands of Belarusians now in Istanbul have all played their roles and changed the dynamic of relationship. According to the 1910 and 1912 census of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, there were about 300,000 Greek Orthodox living in Istanbul, and as the Allied forces entered Istanbul on November 14, 1918, the Greek Orthodox also dreamed about getting rid of the Turkish rule, and they also wanted to contribute to the war between Turkey and Greece at that time. During these days, we also witnessed that the Greek battleship Averov came to the straits, and many Greek Orthodox population watched the passage of the battleship, and they also took part in the Aya Eleftherios Day, as well as other events in support of Venizelos, including the events held at the Taksim Square following the signing of SER agreement. As Melethios was ascended to the throne of the Patriarchate, events continued to be unfolded. The Neologos newspaper editor-in-chief, Stavros Voiteras' son Voiteras, assessed the situation that Constantinopolis, in other words Istanbul, now became the acropolis of Venizelism. Let us also look into Ekaterini Laskiridis' book, My Homeland, Constantinopolis, and 15 Days in the City. This book gives us a very good account about the daily life in the city. And the author herself left the city at 42, by the way, and we can always compare her account with the memoirs of journalist Stefanos Papadopoulos. I hope I will be able to do that very soon. Ekaterina Laskiridou was born in Istanbul in 1909. She passed away in Athens in 2003. She is originally from Darıca. She became known among Greek literature circles in 1938. She was born as the youngest daughter of Dimitri and Olga Laskiridi couple. She was born in Beyoğlu, and she lived in Beyoğlu until 1952. When she was a very young kid, her parents used to live in Beyoğlu at Kastelihan or Kasteli apartment right across the British consulate. They later moved on the present-day Çilek Sokak, which then used to be named Çilek Sokak. The author and her family later on moved to Grand Rue d'Opéra. However, the author did not really mention the exact name of the apartment on Paris Street, but I believe this is on the upper part of the street because it was close. It was very close to the Central Greek Girls' School. And in the tumultuous times of the World War I, the author had many experiences. As she became an adult woman, she also had to face the horrors of the Second World War II. But of course, the most devastating of all was the suffering and catastrophe she experienced in 1922. In 1923, due to security reasons, together with her mom and sister, they left for Romania, where they stayed for 10 months. And on the other hand, Refet Pasha, the governor of Eastern Thrace, also affected the family life by his orders about his father. Yet her father remained in the country, and throughout these extraordinary times, the experiences of minorities in the country left significant impact on the author as a child and really affected her formative years. She started writing short stories at very early ages. Together with her three friends, she wrote Tokisenimia, and her articles and stories were also published in various newspapers or publishing houses. In 1952, she left Istanbul to travel in Europe, Africa, and Latin America. While in Brazil, she met prominent authors of the country, and she started exploring Portuguese language and also compiling an anthology of short stories in Portuguese. When she was away in 1955 in Turkey, we witnessed the September pogroms, and after that, because of the pogroms and all the other political developments, she went back to Athens instead of Istanbul. In Athens, there is this newspaper Opolitis, in other words, which means of Istanbul. This is a newspaper published by Greek Orthodox of Constantinople who were expelled from Turkey because they were being subjects of Greece. And she penned her articles in Opolitis. She published her short stories, and later she published her memoirs in the book entitled 15 Days in My Home, Constantinopolis. The author passed away in Athens in 2003, December 1st, and this is how Opolitis newspaper covered her departure. She is a very significant figure of polis, Constantinopolis, a true Byzantine lady. And she always felt Constantinopolis in her heart, and she carried Constantinopolis throughout her life inside her. So the author had a very vibrant life in her childhood. However, with the outbreak of the First World War, this experience had to change significantly. Her father, from Darıca, was one of the sons of Muhtar Çorbacı Laskiridis and had 11 other siblings. He was a graduate of Fener Greek Boys High School, and he was in grain business. However, with the outbreak of the war, he lost all his vessels in the Black Sea, and as Bolsheviks captured Odessa, he lost his entire property as well as the cement factory called Leon. When it comes to the mother of the author, she was born in Tatavla and she continued to live in Tatavla. However, she was almost about to pass away because of the influenza pandemic that broke out at that time. In her memoirs, the author describes her family as such, and I quote, "During that time, we came across with this very confusing concept of refugee. The number of newspapers published increased, their circulation increased. It was for the first time that we felt fear and uncertainty. And one could really hear the pulses of the Greek Orthodox community, then came full mobilization. But of course, the minority communities could always pay gold in order to avoid mobilization. But what about those who did not have gold? They had to apply for loans and find other ways of doing that. So as a result, end of quote, and as a result, they managed to offer gold to avoid mobilization. In those days, all transactions were still held in gold as there were no paper banknotes. As Allied forces declared their victory, some of their relatives took the very first ship and they went to US. During the war times, the Greek Orthodox community, they were all excited, but at the same time anxious. They would expect triumph with the triumph of the Allied forces indeed. This was their salvation. And of course, they felt that they were obliged to support the Allied forces. At the time, they were not allowed to take up arms. Even though they were expecting the triumph of Allied forces, they would come across with a high-ranking British officer who fell as a prisoner of war, and they came across him in 1916 in Halki. And the author remembers this in her memoirs, and I quote, Major General Charles Ware Ferris always paid attention to Greek Orthodox and did everything to greet us on every occasion. However, the conditions of them as prisoners of war was also quite humane. But the end of the quote. As mobilization continued, the number of deserters also increased, and these were called Taban battalions. But there were also Greek Orthodox serving in the Ottoman army, and one of them was Officer Victor Ohanidis. Amid the war, they would go to Pendik for summer holidays. The German battleships, which was later renamed as Yavuz Sultan Selim and Midilli, would also cross the Marmara Sea by passing from Halki. And our author also reflects this in her memoirs. And she describes how wheat, maize, sources depleted, how field forces depleted, how prices increased, and how deprivation increased in war times. Then, in 1917, came the Spanish influenza, Spanish flu, and in those days, they start rationing bread. And according to the author, this bread was no more like the quality of the bread that they had. So they would make their own bread, and their doorman, Artin Efendi, would take her to the bakery of Christos Bey. There is also Kadri Kaptan, a person who was very close to the family. He was the captain in the vessels of her father, and during the wartime, he used to work in Kasımpaşa forces, Kasımpaşa naval forces. I'll be skipping some of those parts in my intervention. and I will come now close to the conclusion. I do very much hope that you will have the full paper in the conference proceedings. I believe what really matters the most is to revisit these memoirs, to revisit these memories. I have to note that I did not find any diary written by a Greek Orthodox of Istanbul. Of course, it would be really excellent if we could have a more objective assessment of the period, because all accounts of that time might be deceptive. However, as Thrasos Kassanakis had the novel Trap, as well as Yakup Kadri Kara Osmanoğlu Sodom and Gomorrah. So I would like to now argue that we should look into those novels and we should compare them in order to have a full understanding of what happened during the war times, and in parallel memoirs of politicians, memoirs of authors, as well as correspondences will be all very important in order for us to have a good understanding of the period. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Professor Tsilenis.
Thank you, sir.
We have, next is Ms. Panelas, and the title of her presentation is Passports, Nationality, and Statelessness in Late Occupied Istanbul. Please. It's still off, isn't it? Or no, it's on. Is it working for you?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Should I do this one? Okay. So my title is Passports, Nationality, and Statelessness in Late Occupied Istanbul. Statelessness, not necessarily helplessness. When we think about passports and statelessness during the Allied occupation of Istanbul, the first thing that comes to mind is probably the many white Russians who flooded into the city. We may also think about the Nansen passports, which were travel documents for stateless people facilitated by the League of Nations, later given to these white Russians. We may also think about the many Armenians who survived the genocide and found themselves in virtually every corner of the world carrying all manner of travel documents. Some of them, too, would later receive Nansen passports as a mark of internationally recognized statelessness. But there were other smaller groups of people who garnered less international attention who also found themselves on the margins of nationality in the last year of the occupation and the beginning of the Republican era. Today I'm going to talk about some of them. Because the Allied occupation was a time of competing, overlapping, and unclear sovereignties, it offers a unique window into the early days of the passport regime. Different centers of power issued different kinds of travel documents, often with little concern for where people carrying these documents might go or how they would support themselves. Nationality, an aspect of identity that had meant a lot of different things in the latter days of the Ottoman Empire, now started to have very real implications for where people could live, how they could travel, and their relationship to the state they lived in, as well as an emerging international system. In the 5 years after World War I, refugees fled their home soil in numbers never seen before. With this came the international concept of the stateless refugee, a person who fell under no state's protection and had no home country to return to. Much of the Eastern Mediterranean was already receiving refugees from genocide and war when the fire of Smyrna and the subsequent refugee crisis ensured that refugees began arriving at any and every port that would allow them to land. What would happen to them after that was a roll of the dice. I'll start by giving a brief summary of the state of passports in the world in 1922, then show some examples of some passports coming out of the occupation era, and talk about some of the clashes and issues surrounding travel documents toward the end of the occupation. Sorry guys. I'll try to go slower. Finally, I'll end with a story of Odyssey-like journeys of people who found themselves stateless. Before World War I, passport regulations were generally inconsistent across the world. They were used and in some places required, but by no means universal. World War I changed all that, and as countries began locking down their borders to stop potential soldiers from fleeing and prevent enemy subjects from entering, passports became internationally necessary for travel. In the post-war world, many hoped that the passport would disappear, as many, League of Nations leaders among them, felt that passports hampered travel and threatened international integrity. The League of Nations put together a conference on passports, customs, formalities, and through tickets in 1920. Although they were not able to negotiate an end to passports as they had hoped, they attempted to standardize them. A passport was generally issued for just one journey, though the conference decided that countries could choose to give them 2-year validity. Whereas many passports before had been a single page, now they would be in a cardboard-bound booklet with recommended dimensions. Though this was a step towards standardization, there was no established consensus about who could issue passports to whom, what kind of other travel documents would allow people to travel, and what kind of responsibility states had to the people they issued travel documents to. These were still the flying blind days of the passport regime. During the Allied occupation, people who wished to leave the city or leave the country through Istanbul could attain travel documents from any number of different authorities. Allied military authorities assumed control of passport checks and set up the Inter-Allied Passport Bureau, a structure they had similarly used in Salonika during the war. All those wishing to leave had to obtain an inter-allied exit visa upon whatever travel document they were using, though those documents could take many forms. Naturally, foreigners who had a functioning embassy in the city could apply for a passport from their respective governments. Ottoman subjects could also apply for passports from the Istanbul government until late 1922. Here's an example of an Ottoman passport from roughly that time period. But other kinds of travel documents were also used to leave the city. British sources state that Greek and Armenian Ottomans were leaving with passports issued by their respective patriarchates, stamped with an inter-allied exit visa. Although British sources refer to these as passports, Turkish sources refer to them as vesayik, or documents, implying that they might not have had the word passports printed on them. I unfortunately don't have any examples of these documents, so I can only speculate that since the most important part about travel documents before the war was that they confirmed a person's identity, these documents were likely identity documents issued by the patriarchates, which could be used for travel in place of an Ottoman passport. This could be done during the occupation era because Allied passport control cared mainly about certifying a person's identity and making sure that they had Allied permission to leave. Another form of non-passport travel document issued at this time was the laissez-passer. While the French phrase was once associated mainly with diplomatic documents, these laissez-passer did not give the bearer any special status and offered them no protection from the issuing state. You can see a line here that specifically says that this is valid for one journey which the person carrying the document undertakes at their own risk. You can see it right here. One of these is a British laissez-passer and the other is a French, but both were issued to Russians. You can see the exit visa stamps at the bottom. Occupying powers issued such documents to people who were not their subjects for a number of reasons. Sometimes, as most likely the case in the case of these Russians, they wanted to get rid of undesirable refugees wherever they could. Giving them papers to leave meant that they became someone else's problem. Other times, issuing travel documents to certain populations was an act of asserting sovereignty over a certain territory. Stacey Fahrenhold's work on the Syrian and Lebanese diaspora shows that the French issued laissez-passer to Syrians and Lebanese in order to embrace them as subjects, thus asserting their claims over Greater Syria, without having to offer them the rights of citizenship. In this way, travel documents could also be a way of asserting control over a population or territory. Controlling who can enter and who can leave became a basic statement of sovereignty in the wake of the First World War. With this in mind, here is a French laissez-passer issued in Sicilia and a departure permit issued by the Greek police in Izmir, both to Armenians. After the Greek defeat in Anatolia, the fire of Smyrna, and the ensuing refugee crisis, a panic erupted across many groups in Istanbul. Ottoman Christians specifically, but also many groups of foreigners and certain groups of Ottoman Muslims feared that Istanbul would be similarly decimated, or that they would be targeted for retribution if the nationalists took control of the city. A mass exodus ensued. By the end of October, Horace Rumbold, the British High Commissioner to Istanbul, estimated that around 3,000 Ottoman Greeks specifically were leaving the city every week. It is estimated that between October and December 1922, around 50,000 non-Muslim Ottomans left Istanbul. They left carrying many different kinds of documents, an action which would have grave consequences later, as the Ankara government would soon decide that Ottoman subjects who left without a Turkish or Ottoman passport would not be allowed to return to Turkey. The work of Dimitris Kamouzis follows a group of Ottoman Greeks who left carrying such documents and who, despite technically being exempt from the population exchange as Greeks of Istanbul, would not be allowed to return to Turkey because of this policy. Ottoman Armenians would experience a similar fate as Turkish embassies and consulates denied Turkish documents to Armenians abroad, even at first Armenians carrying Ottoman passports. Hence why such a large proportion of Ottoman Armenians would become stateless. Refet Pasha, Ankara's government in charge of Eastern Thrace, arrived in Istanbul on October 19, 1922, and began taking control of the city's administration. By early November, he decreed that no passports should be given to Ottoman subjects without a final visa from the Turkish police, allowing the Ankara government to decide which Ottoman subjects could leave. The Allies, however, ignored this and continued to provide exit documents for panicked people trying to get out. The tension came to a head on December 4th when Turkish police started tearing up the travel documents of Ottoman subjects going through customs at the port in Galata. General Harrington, commander of the British forces, sent Marines with machine guns down to the port to force the people through. Obviously, this isn't a picture of the actual incident, but it is a picture of British soldiers with guns, so I thought it was appropriate. This incident prompted Harrington to propose declaring a state of martial law, though the Italians and French were less keen on forcing the issue. Though the Allies were outraged by the affront to their authority and felt a show of force was necessary in order to maintain the image of control, they agreed in principle that Ottoman subjects should not be leaving without Turkish passports. After getting assurances from Refet Pasha that Ottoman Christians would not be prevented from leaving, they agreed that Ottoman subjects were, in principle, the purview of the Ankara government. From then on out, any Ottoman subject who the Allies wanted to evacuate from Istanbul without being stopped by Turkish police would have to be evacuated secretly. And the people who were evacuated in this manner would be the only Ottoman subjects carrying non-passport travel documents. The Armenian Patriarch was the most notable of these clandestine evacuations which took place after the passport rule. But numerous compromised Ottoman subjects who had helped the Allies would be evacuated in this way. All others would have to apply for Turkish passports and get permission to leave from Ankara. I'll now shift to telling a bit of a story. It begins on November 5th, 1922, a few weeks after Refet Pasha's entrance into Istanbul and just days after the Grand National Assembly abolished the Sultanate. On this day, Ali Kemal, a prominent anti-nationalist journalist, was arrested by nationalist agents in Beyoğlu and removed from the city. He would later be brutally executed in Izmit. Upon hearing of Ali Kemal's arrest, other anti-nationalist intellectuals and civil servants who feared that they would be next took refuge in the British embassy. General Harrington then took these people under his protection and temporarily housed them at the Teşişkle barracks, right over there. The British army, deciding that perpetually keeping these people in Istanbul would prove a source of embarrassment, put them on a ship to Dedeyaç, or Alexandropoli, on November 15th. Some of them carried Ottoman passports issued to them before the resignation of the Istanbul government. Others carried only British laissez-passer. In this way, the end of the Allied occupation created another category of stateless person in the world. The British would refer to them as compromised Turks, though the majority of them were ethnically Circassian or Kurdish. Although only 145 people were directly evacuated by the British in this manner, there were many more who would fall into this category, who left on their own, many of them who also carried laissez-passer. Tarık Mumtaz, aide-de-camp to the Sultan, for example, would leave for Bulgaria in November 1922, supplied with British laissez-passer. To his chagrin, when he asked the British embassy in Sofia for another travel pass to go to join the Sultan in Malta, the British would reply that they had done their duty by providing him with a document to be able to leave the city, but that they no longer had any responsibility to him. He had found himself in a legal limbo, and years later would vividly remember how his inability to obtain travel documents added insult to injury. Many who had allied themselves with the British at great personal risk would now become unwanted refugees. Many of these men, but not all of them, would in April 1924 find themselves on the list of 150 Muslim Ottomans who would be left out of the general amnesty provided by the Treaty of Lausanne. They would be stripped of their Turkish citizenship and be unable to return to Turkey for over a decade. Though they would later be eligible for Nansen passports, for the first few years of their exile, they would struggle to find refuge anywhere. The group of compromised Turks that the British themselves evacuated would begin a long odyssey across the Mediterranean. The British would chafe at having made themselves responsible for these people and complain about the cost of their upkeep and transport. First, they were landed at Dereyac, where it was hoped that they would be able to make their own way to Alexandria, but due to the massive influx of ships and refugees in the port, this seemed impossible, and the ship was shortly thereafter sent to Piraeus, near Athens. Immediately upon landing, the Greek government protested. Amidst the massive refugee crisis and influx of Greeks from Anatolia, the Greek government would certainly not take any Turkish refugees. The British ambassador quickly shipped them off to Alexandria, where General Allenby also complained that he had little ability to take them. Within a few months, he managed to send them to the Hejaz to join the Sultan, but they quickly overstayed their welcome there, as King Hussein complained that he was forced to give them an allowance to keep them from starvation. They had left Turkey with scarce resources, having worked as intellectuals and administrators most of their lives, and could not find work in the Hejaz. Their sad story would demand the pitiless attention of the British Foreign Office for at least a year after their evacuation. The British Foreign Office learned a valuable lesson from this group. It is not enough to evacuate people. You also have to make sure they have somewhere to go and financial resources to support themselves. They would remember this as they withdrew their final troops from Istanbul and evacuated the rest of the people who were compromised by their association with the British. In late September 1923, the Foreign Office was quite pleased with themselves as they had secured refuge for 125 Ottoman Armenians who had assisted the British. The Armenian Patriarch in Alexandria had agreed to take responsibility for their maintenance so that after they were evacuated from Istanbul by the British, they would not appeal to the British in Egypt for support. On October 3rd, the ship carrying these people arrived in the port of Alexandria, but to the surprise and frustration of British military forces, on board were also 88 stowaways. 26 Ottoman Armenians, 58 Ottoman Greeks, and 4 Ottoman Jews, all young men over the age of 14, had snuck onto the ship in a desperate attempt to flee Turkey. British military authorities refused to let them disembark, and after the original group of Armenians got off, the ship was immediately sent to Cyprus, and the British again debated how they might rid themselves of these young men. Though the British consul in Istanbul asked if they might be returned to Turkey, their flight without Turkish passports had constituted a forfeiture of Turkish nationality, as they were also likely fleeing military service, hence their inability to get Turkish passports. They would also likely be executed for desertion if sent back. The Armenian community in Cyprus or Alexandria might be appealed upon to take in more Armenians, but what of the Greeks? The Greek state was under no obligation to take these people, as they were Istanbul Greeks and thus technically Turkish subjects. Considering they were already deluged with refugees, the Foreign Office thought they might be unwilling to take more. The Foreign Office wrote to the British Mandate authorities in Palestine, asking them to take the 4 Jewish men, and then began pleading with the Greek government to take the Greeks. The Greek government eventually agreed, if only because they were young, able-bodied men capable of being put to work. And luckily 6 of the Armenians and 13 of the Greeks had already managed to find employment in Cyprus before their fate was even settled. While these stowaways were also a group of unwanted refugees, their youth and physical ability to work made them easier to settle. The stories of these people illustrate how passports became intimately connected to statelessness after the First World War. The cementing of borders and the introduction of passport controls meant that every person was supposed to have a nationality. Because the war also resulted in the breakup of multi-ethnic empires into nation states, achieving this required a sorting of people into national categories. Being stateless in the era of nationality meant not just that a person lacked a passport, but that they lacked a state which was obliged to take them in, leaving them in a legal no man's land. But, as we saw from these stories, flight without a passport, which represented leaving without the permission of one's home state, could in and of itself render a person stateless. The passport regime was implemented quite haphazardly, and sorting people into national categories was complicated and messy at many places in this time. But the Allied occupation made these already messy international changes even messier because there were so many different centers of power and competing sovereignties. The lack of consensus about which people belonged where led to many people, legally speaking, belonging nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Panelas. Our next speaker is Dr. Okumuş, and I neglected to announce his title when I first introduced him, and I want to apologize, but the title of his talk is The Footprints of the Gulbenkians in Istanbul After First World War. So, please, Dr. Okumuş.
Thank you. Günaydın herkes.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Hrant Dink Foundation for hosting us here nicely for the last 2 days. Thank you so much. The administration of the foundation, the board of trustees, members and volunteers, thank you so much. My research is focusing on the Gulbenkian family in general, so in this specific paper I will be presenting you a small portion of a bigger and larger research. Of course, the Gulbenkian family is very attractive for me because, especially in the second half of 19th century all the way up to the 20th century until the declaration of the Republic, they have been a very influential family in the commercial arena of Istanbul. They don't only have a few small enterprises, but when we say the Gulbenkians, we immediately think about Kaust Gulbenkian, and it's only natural that it is the case because he is world famous, he has an important foundation, he has a big collection of art, so it's no surprise that Calouste is the first person to come to your mind when we say the Gulbenkian family, but it would be misleading to think that the Gulbenkians only composed of Calouste, especially the family living in Istanbul, and I'll talk about the details in a minute. So, Calouste Gulbenkian was a leading figure among the family members, and this happened at a very early age. The initial biography of Calouste Gulbenkian was written in 1930, and in the upcoming years many books have been published about him. But we are lucky that Jonathan Conlin published the biography a few years ago, answering many questions we have about Calouste Gulbenkian. Even the questions that we did not have in our minds were answered in that biography. So, maybe we should set aside the discussions about Calouste Gulbenkian, and it's time to focus on the other members of the Gulbenkian family. So, as I said, especially in the second half of 19th century, the Gulbenkians have been an important family in Istanbul. But what do we find about the Gulbenkians in Istanbul after the First World War? Or can we even find anything? Is there anything that remains of them? So this will be the topic of this specific presentation. And to illustrate this, I will start with a small comparison. This is from 1881 Oriental Directory. This is the page allocated to the Gulbenkian family. As you can see, we don't see many names, but the names that are there are the leading figures of the family. Apel Gulbenkian, Garabet, Badrik Gulbenkian, Gaspard Gulbenkian, Johannes Parsek, and of course Serovpe and Sarkis Gulbenkian's names are listed here in the directory. So we also have the Armenian version of the directory of commerce. So let's take a look at their addresses. We say they are operating in small and big Ashirian business office, and in the Ashir Efendi Han, as we call it, these are the office numbers in the Han. From 1 to 20, all the offices are allocated to Gulbenkians. We have 41 offices, meaning half of them are used by the Gulbenkian family, this Han, this office block. And in the second one, offices 3 and 4 are used by them. We have Serovpe and Sarkis Gulbenkian that are important here. And in Kürkcihan, Gulbenkian name is mentioned. I didn't want to list them all here, but I just wanted to share the ones that I think are important. So, from 1881 to the turn of the century, we see now that there are 21 individuals from the Gulbenkian family that are part of the Oriental Directory of Commerce. We of course cannot say that they are all involved in commerce. They have, some of them have other functions and professions, but they're still on the list. But the fact that the number has increased so much is that Gulbenkian family is more and more influential, not only in the commercial life, but in the social life as well. Maybe in a different setting, we can make a comparison with other Armenian families to see which other Armenian families are this actively involved in the commercial scene of Istanbul. So that's a question that we need to answer. So maybe there are more Armenian families, but still I'm sure that the Gulbenkians would rank at the top. However, this picture is changing when we come to 1914. From 21, we go down to 17 individuals, and the wealthy members of the family are no longer in the list. And come 1922, there is a huge decrease in the list, and the names that were mentioned have turned into company names. So it's a decreasing trend. Of course, this is no surprise, because after 1890, I will show you the figures. It is seen that the Gulbenkian family members are leaving Istanbul gradually. So, to make it more concrete, I would like to draw your attention to this record, to this family tree. Gül abi is the oldest known name from the Gulbenkian family, born in Kayseri Talas. He has two sons, Serovpe and Sarkis, among the most influential merchants in Istanbul, esteemed merchants. And then Kalust is born in 1869 as first son of Sarkis, and then Serovpe also has children. So what I want to focus on here is a member of the Gulbenkian family that has never ever been mentioned in the literature or in the book. So I will be looking for the traces of his footprints. Yes, we can find some information about some familiar names, but what can we say about a totally unfamiliar, unknown name? The person I'm going to talk about is Serovpe Vahan, who is the son of Hovannes and Araksi, born in Istanbul. By the way, Araksi Hanım, she is also a descendant of a very important Armenian family. She is the granddaughter of Arakeldatyan, who is the chief procurer of gunpowder during the reign of Selim III. So, a very important Armenian family. So, she comes from an important family. Her mother's name is Nazik and her father's name is Vahan. So, their son Serovpe is named after the grandfather, meaning the father of the father Hovannes, and also he gets the name of his grandfather from the mother's side. So he uses three names: Serovpe, Vahan, Hovannes. By the way, pay attention to this. Araksi died in 1894 and Hovannes died in 1894 again. And Serovpe Vahan Hovannes was born in 1893. So he started a very difficult life. And imagine what happened at that time in Istanbul in the 1890s, well, making a connection between the death of the parents with the incidents would be an attractive solution for an historian, but I couldn't find any concrete evidence. But again, the 1890s is the period when the Gulbenkians started to leave Istanbul, because at that time Sarkis also died. 1893 is the death year of Sarkis. So that's the time when they start to leave Istanbul. Calouste would also be leaving for Europe after that. So I will talk about Serovpe Vahan, and he was born in 1893 into a very difficult life. So this one is very complicated. I'll try to explain. So Araksi Hanım and Ohannes Bey, after they died, this is the record of their inheritance, records of estates or inheritances. This is from my personal collection, actually. This shows who will inherit their assets and properties. By the way, this document is drafted in a very classic manner. I won't go into the details of it, but first listed is the address where they live. They live in Kadıköy, Osman Ağa district, Moda Avenue. Then the date of their death is given. Ohannes has died on the 19th of January, 1894. 1 month after, on the 17th of February, his wife, Araksi Hanım, has died. So there is just 1 month between their time of death. And then this record talks about the properties of the people. For instance, for Ohannes Gulbenkian, it says esteemed merchant. It means he is an esteemed merchant of Istanbul. And talking about Araksi Hanım, it is mentioned that she is the granddaughter of Arakel Efendi. This is an important information. So it also says that their son was just 4 months old when they died. So it means that Servop was born in 1893 in October. So their property has to go to their son. But as the son is not a major, is still a minor, a trustee is appointed. The trustee is Badrik Gulbenkian. So all the listed assets and properties are given to him as trustee. I won't read the details of all the properties and assets, but it is giving us a calculation of the economic value of all the assets they have, and it's turned into a total figure. And also on the document, it is written who inherits these assets. This is a very proper transaction for deceased people, of course. However, things will change later. So after the parents die in 1894, as he is a minor, he wasn't able to directly inherit the goods. But in 1912, as he becomes he is no longer a minor, he asks for these properties. So he goes to London and applies to the King's Bench Division by hiring an attorney to Badrik Gulbenkian to his trustee to get the property. So Badrik Gulbenkian is explaining here in detail that he is accepting this, but he says the London courts would have no jurisdiction over this case because it's not relevant with the London officials. So he says that the case should be actually seen in Istanbul. So he writes a petition to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It seems that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has accepted this, so that the case is also seen by the Istanbul court. So this is again from my personal collection, and we get a lot of detail about the assets of the family in Istanbul. As I said, I'm not talking about leading figures of the family like Calouste Gulbenkian. I'm talking about a member of the family whose name is not even mentioned in the books, and you will see how influential even that person was. So this document explains in detail that the child was still a small child when his parents died. It lists one by one all the things inherited from the family, like a watch from Servop, the father. It makes an economic calculation of the value, and in total how much money he inherited is calculated. Apart from this, it talks about the Gulbenkian Han in Sirkeci, in Galata, in Makaracılar Street, there is a coffee house and a shop. Shares from these have been given to him. The numbers are mentioned here. So this is also combined with the inheritance he receives from his mother. So in total, 902,000 kurush worth of inheritance is available for him, and as now he is no longer a minor, he can get this, and Badrik Gulbenkian has accepted to give this to him, and he has received it from him. And it goes on to say that in exchange of his debt, he is also giving up some of the shares of some companies established in Istanbul, such as Ohanes Gulbenkian and the Company, and Gulbenkian Brothers and Company. So this document is signed by Serov Pevahan on August 13th, 1913, just 1 year before the First World War. Of course, during the World War, Serov Pevahan and Badrik Gulbenkian continued to have some commercial exchanges. Some properties were sold and purchased. So these are some of the title deeds. We have so many of these title deeds. I'll just show you some of them. For instance, this one is from a property in Üsküdar, a house most probably. So the title deed was transferred to Serov P. You can see the signatures at the bottom of the document. And the most important document is this one, because after the First World War, the information we can find about Gulbenkians is listed here. We have so many pieces of information here. Maybe I will write a separate article about this. I won't dwell on all of them now, but how can we use this information? The fact that we have seen that there was a house on a particular address. So I'll just explain. At the bottom it says a house in Kayseri, Talas in Gulbenk district. So it talks about his shares in a house. But there is no such district in literature. Gulbenk district doesn't exist. Well, it doesn't exist today. But even in the books, I couldn't find it. And I have to say that maybe this district was actually established by the Gulbenkians. They had their own district, their own neighborhood. How can I say this? Here, this is the Jizye tax register book from 1843. This is the Gulbenk district, the neighborhood, and the information about people living there. And Gulabi's name is mentioned. And it says that Gulabi is from the highest taxpayer class. Jizye is a particular tax here, so he was paying his tax from the highest class. This is just one example. There's more information, but I don't want to distract you. But if we trace the footprints of Gulabi, we see the directory, commerce directory of 1868 from Istanbul. So he was there in this Istanbul commercial directory. So this is changing all the information that we knew so far about the Gulbenkians, because the records were showing us that actually he sent his children to Istanbul. However, we see that even before he sent his children to Istanbul, he was himself in Istanbul. It says H. Gulabi. H means he was a pilgrim, a hajı, because he went to pilgrimage. So what happens to Serov Pevahan? I couldn't find out when exactly he left Turkey, but he died in Paris in 1987, and his parents are now buried in the cemetery right next to the Sırpırgıç Hospital. So Badrik Gulbenkian actually goes to US, and this is his wife Virginia, who died in Istanbul. This is his application for American citizenship, and he received American citizenship. He applied for American citizenship in 1929, but right after that, about in 1 year, unfortunately, he dies. And this is the Gulbenkian Cemetery in New York, and Badrik Gulbenkian is buried here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Okumuş. We now have the opportunity for questions and comments from the audience.
Merhaba. Benim
Hello, I have a question for all three speakers. I'll start with Professor Tsilenis. You talked about Arria Clondia's family. You said that they lost their assets, properties, and jobs. What kind of things is she talking about in her book about the war? How does she depict her emotions? And Allison.
on this topic because as a cinema historian, I get to see these different personas from filmmakers, production in different areas in Istanbul, and they don't have citizenships, Ottoman citizenship, and they're expats, and when they leave the country, we don't know where they go. So it was very interesting, thank you. For the Ottoman case, you gave examples, but how about, for instance, the cases in Austria-Hungary or different empires which was similar to Ottoman case? Did they have permits or did they have citizenship issues? Any ideas about that? Thank you. And Ali, tam bir tarih.
Well, you have prepared everything very professionally as a historian. I was just wondering, why this family in particular? Why the Gulbenkians? Why were you interested in them? Because maybe was it the reason that because you had so many resources and information about them, or was it a simple reason? Thank you. Well, yes, thank you so much for this question. I wasn't able to talk about it in my speech, but I will read one paragraph with your permission. Well, first of all, the family is a supporter of Venizelos, meaning nationalist, but she was able to explain these very well. It says all the Greek newspapers were on the newspaper stands, and on the front pages we would always see the blue Greek flag floating with proud, and we had Choliades, special forces and soldiers of the Greek army. They were walking in the streets of Istanbul, and we were saying, "Wake up, my poor Rhea, see the freedom, wake up." And my father would take us to see the legendary vessel, the Azarov vessel, and I wore my white hat, and we also put a blue ribbon on top of it. I remember exactly. And mother was prudent, actually. She was saying the Greek flag should not be borne by the vessel, and they shouldn't also put the Greek flag in the bedroom window. She was begging her husband to not to rush anything. For years we had the blue and white flag waiting there in the closet, but we also had to wait for some more time to put it out. And we had the General Ioanni and other officers, members of the National Committee, and we were also supposed to entertain them in the Panelas Hotel. And in the Greek society, the Patrick III Joachim and his followers, and the leader of the opposition, Patrick V Germanus supporters, did not talk about the author in their memories. And on the Mass, on the day of 5th of October 1918, on a Sunday, the people and the clergy made great noise, and this was shaking the situation of Germanos V, and the author doesn't write anything about these incidents in her memoirs. I don't know this satisfies your question. Thank you.
My question. In short, I believe that the passport regime in the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was also a mess. And I think that, and again, like I've tried to look into this a number of times, and I haven't yet found too much on it, and probably because it was such a mess. But I think that one thing also is that, I think the important thing to remember about passports before World War I is that they generally, overall, internationally, weren't completely necessary. What was really important when you traveled was something that certified your identity. And the passport could do that, but other things could do that too. And that was like the most important thing. And so in some of these places where there's kind of chaos around what nationality people have, sometimes people were able to travel just on something that said, this is who I am. An interesting, like with this statelessness aspect, a kind of more interesting parallel is of course Russia, because the Russian Empire actually had very similar passport regulations to the Ottoman Empire. Like Imperial Russia had somewhat similar, and they're kind of, and then obviously in the war, White Russians are then also stateless, and so the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because they're redrawing all of these states, like I think everything becomes kind of chaotic, and that sometimes can make the statelessness actually a little bit easier because everybody's kind of stateless. But I don't have a great answer for that. Sorry.
Çok teşekkür ediyorum.
Thank you so much for this question. Well, my interest in the Gulbenkians started as a coincidence, actually. I was working on the Turkish petroleum company, making research on this, and I was trying to not to get involved with the Gulbenkians, quote unquote. I really resisted. But as I was researching the history of oil, wherever I looked, there were the Gulbenkians. They always came across, not only in the oil industry and their influence in the oil industry. Yes, in Jonathan Conlin's book, the influence of Gulbenkians on the oil industry is explained very well. However, in the Chamber of Commerce, for instance, 1 out of the 7 administrators of the chamber is from the Gulbenkian family. So if we were to list 7 most influential names of Istanbul, 1 would be a member of the Gulbenkian family. This alone was enough for me to be interested in them. And in history, when it's about these disputed issues, we are drawn into these issues. I personally am very interested about these things. At one point, I always decided to stop working on the Gulbenkians, but then I was able to get hold of some documents. Then again, Gulbenkians became an interest for me. Well, I wasn't able to go into the details here, but if we were to establish the in-family relations, we would see how Kalus Gulbenkian was this influential in the world. Maybe we would understand it better. Was it the family who helped him become an important figure, or was it because of his own personal skills that he was able to become this influential? So we need to understand this, and I'm sure there is still a lot of room for research in this area.
Ali hocam, benim size bir sorum olacaktı da.
Dr. Ali, I have a question for you. You said the Gulbenkian family, right before the establishment of the republic, they left Turkey and they had to go to other countries, you said. So looking at it, the Istanbul Stock Exchange at that time, according to the British documents, the Kemalist government, when the rumor spread that it would move to Ankara, maybe they were also worried that the commercial activities would also be moving to Ankara. Or Said Halim Pasha from the Committee of Union and Progress, he was selling the shares to the British and Germans under the name of privatization. Was it also influential, you think? Well, thank you. Honestly, I don't know the answer to your question. because Ankara is a different topic of research. Kayseri is actually attached to the province of Ankara, and Gulbenkians are to be found in that area as well. We can even ask, let's make a research on the Gulbenkians in Baghdad. For instance, Parsik Gulbenkian is very influential from Iraq to Egypt, from all the way to Europe. He's very influential. So Gulbenkians are even seen in the United States today, for instance. So it's very difficult to answer this question if you don't select a specific region and make research on this. So I don't know about the Ankara region. Belma Saraç is my name. Again, a question for Dr. Ali. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation, very interesting. The Gulbenkian family, starting from the 19th century, became very influential in the Ottoman Empire. And Cevat Bey and the Minister of Finance, they have very good relations with him. With UK, Germany and Ottoman Empire, they have diplomatic skills to manage the relations between these countries and the Ottoman Empire. I was just wondering, the real foundation of Gulbenkian family is in Portugal, right? Why Portugal? Why not France or England? Why did they establish that foundation in Portugal? I think he has a will, I'm sure you know it. In London, he wanted to open a big Center of Arts because he has a huge collection. I was just wondering why they chose Portugal. As a result of your research, do you know this?
Tabii vakfı konuşmak.
Well, talking about the foundation is a total different subject of a specific research or a paper, but very briefly to answer your question, the Gulbenkian went to Portugal when? You can understand actually the reason. It's 1940s, beginning of 1940s, meaning the Second World War was still ongoing and the Germans were approaching Paris. And the art gallery in Paris is very close to the central square, so the Gulbenkian doesn't want it to be damaged. And he even was considering allocating his art collection to the British Museum on a temporary basis. But upon the invitation of the Portuguese ambassador, I remember he goes to Portugal, if I'm not mistaken. But that was not the only option. He chose Portugal out of many different options. Maybe he thought initially that would be a temporary option because Portugal was an impartial country in the war. But then it seems that he really loved Portugal. There is a wonderful museum. The art collection there is the biggest, one of the biggest art collections. Catalogs have been published. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you to go and see it. Wonderful manuscripts, wonderful pieces of art. And we are also waiting for the catalog of his library also, because I'm so interested in learning what kind of books Gulbenkian was reading. We can only see a small portion of it, but all the books in his library, if a catalog would be published, it would be extremely useful, I believe. Thank you.
Teşekkür ederim. Ali Bey, ben de Ali Bey'e soru.
I also have a question to Ali Okumuş. I showed that a bit late, so perhaps I missed the beginning of your intervention, so I'm so sorry if I missed that. But now that the Gulbenkian family was so influential in so many spheres, their denomination, I think it may also play the role like Catholic, Protestant, Apostolic. Have you looked into the denomination of the Gulbenkian family? Are they members of the Catholic denomination or Gregorian community?
Farklı mezhepler de olabilir ailenin içerisinde.
There may be family members of different denominations, by the way, because they spread around a vast geography. We're talking about a family spanning from America, from the US to Middle East. And by the end of the 19th century, this is a very big family. I may be mistaken if I assert that majority of the family members are of Gregorian or Apostolic or Orthodox, but I believe that Mr. Calouste Gulbenkian was of Gregorian denomination. I have a question to Ali Bey as well, Ali Okumuş. Gulbenkian family and the family's collaboration or competition with the Ottoman Central Bank. What is your take on this? Is there any competition between the family and the Ottoman Central Banks or other banks? The lady actually referred us to Cavit Bey. Cavit Bey, the finance minister of the time. I'm sure you are well aware of the memoirs of Cavit Bey. In his memoirs, he noted that when when they wanted to get a loan for the Ottoman Bank, they also asked the assistance of Gulbenkian. I'm not really talking about these efforts to get an external loan in those years, but the Ottoman Central Bank was established in 1856 as an exportation bank, but for quite a long time, the Ottoman Central Bank cannot really operate in Anatolia, and as I understand, there is also a fierce competition. So when you look into how Ottoman Central Bank grew and opened branches in Anatolia, it also is possible after 1880s. So I'm not really talking specifically about Calouste Gulbenkian, but the family as such. When I looked into the commerce registries, I can see that the family Gulbenkian was in banking business, so they are named as bankers. But I don't know if they were engaged with the Ottoman Central Bank or perhaps Deutsche Bank of Germany. It is not, of course, possible to put it very clearly, but this is my personal opinion. The Gulbenkian family never preferred to work only with one interlocutor or only with one partner. They were very skilled at channeling the business to the right people, to the right partners. I think this is the genius of the family. Just a very brief example if we have enough time. For instance, the Gulbenkian family was in the wool business. One may not really find this in the literature, and I also had a second thought as to study this topic too. In Ankara and Kayseri, they were involved in Angora wool business until the 1890s, and I found some petitions in Ottoman archives. Everyone involved in this Angora wool business, in fact, received a petition from the Gulbenkian family that other newcomers cannot really enter the business because they are operating the business themselves, and the petitioners mostly included members of the Gulbenkian family. And they also have another trade route starting from Egypt all the way to Europe. Actually, they purchase Angora wool, they process Angora wool, and then they export it through certain ports and harbors to Europe. And while doing so, they work with a different company in Istanbul, and they work with another company in Egypt. They work with yet another company in Aleppo. So I'm pretty sure that they had certain relationship with the Ottoman Central Bank, but I cannot really recall a concrete document, but I'm also assuming that they also pursued a similar relationship with the German Deutsche Bank.
We have questions for our other panelists. No offense. We just don't want to. Do we have questions for our other panelists? Yes, please.
Hi. Thank you all very much for the wonderful presentations. I have a question for Allison. You mentioned how this history offers a window into the sort of overlapping systems of sovereignty in this period and in this place. And I was wondering if it also offers a window into the sort of gaps in sovereignty in this particular time and place, and if the historical actors in which you study, perhaps if you could speak a bit about how they used these gaps to maybe navigate the issues they were facing or profit off them.
Gaps. So the two examples I used were a group of people that many of whom were part of the Yüzyıllıklar, and then the stowaways who snuck onto the boat, and the stowaways sneaking onto the boat. There's a lot of like using an opening there. I'm not sure that I see that necessarily as a gap of sovereignty, right? Because they are technically, Turkish subjects, subject to the sovereignty of the Turkish state, and then they see an opening where they can sneak onto a British military ship, and that's how they're gonna leave Istanbul. Because they likely could not get passports, get permission to leave for both military service, perhaps financial reasons, and so they throw themselves into a kind of. But then of course the question is how much sovereignty do you have if you can't control who gets on your boat, but people certainly used these systems. Like if one authority would tell them no, they could go to another authority that would tell them yes. And sometimes like with the Yüzyıllıklar, a lot of them had these British laissez-passer, and the British were trying to take like a hard line on being like, no, we're not going to help you anymore. But then a lot of them ended up getting visas to go where they needed to go, and so. The people used these systems in whatever way that they could. It put them in a difficult position, and it was not by any stretch of the imagination easy. And the British certainly didn't make it easier for them. But yeah, sorry, I don't have a great answer to the gaps part of that, I think. Yeah.
Other questions for our panelists? We have about 5 minutes. I have a question then, if I can ask to Allison. And it was, according to David Gutman, during the Hamidian period, Armenians who wished to leave the Ottoman Empire to go to the United States in particular had to renounce their citizenship. Do you see any connection there with what the new Turkish government was trying to do in terms of this way? Did they make any reference to that practice in the end? Because supposedly during the second constitutional period, the Young Turks had done away with that practice, but then it sounds like it came back with the return of some of the Young Turks to power, some of the CUP to power.
I haven't seen any explicit reference to, we did, like the Ottoman state did this before, so we can do this again. I haven't seen a specific reference to that. But there certainly is, like, it's not without precedent to say that, like, leaving without a passport or leaving without permission constitutes a forfeiture of nationality. And I think that, and that's one thing that, like, I think that the Allied powers, specifically the British, were trying to argue this is a slap in the face of international law, which is, of course, they're just making up international law at that point anyway.
The laws of civilization.
Yeah, exactly. But I think what's important about that is to underline that there absolutely was precedent for stripping people of their nationality for leaving without permission or leaving without a passport, although it, in slightly different circumstances. And then, of course, also Imperial Russia, had similar policies, and then Soviet Russia also did as well. And I believe actually, and nobody quote me on this, but I believe that actually, interestingly, if you follow that thread a little bit later, Muslim Greeks who were stripped of their Greek nationality in the following decades, the justification was often that they left without passports. And so this idea that leaving without permission means that you have allied yourself with another power. It's an interesting motif, at least.
Thank you. Any last questions? We have 1 minute.
It's okay.
Okay. Well, thank you for this. Let's please thank our panelists.
Thank you.